Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week we have another returning guest. Please welcome back Anthony Kaldellis. I think it's about 4 years now since you were on the podcast the last time. And we discussed Emperor Alexius Comnenus the First, of course. And it's a great pleasure to have you back. And you have recently, early this year, released, which I'm holding up here, the new Roman Empire, history of Byzantium. And this is what we are going to discuss today. And hasn't been, as I think you mentioned earlier on in the book as well, there hasn't been a book on Byzantium on this scale before until now. Why do you think that is? That you are kind of the first one to write a book, and if you look at the size of this, it's quite massive. So, what do you think? Why do you think this hasn't happened until now? That we got such a thorough history of Byzantium.
So thank you for having me on. First of all, it's a pleasure to speak with you again. I didn't realize it had been 4 years already. There have been long books, histories of Byzantium. Mine is perhaps the first in the 21st century. There are two others on a similar scale that have been used in the past half century. There's Ostrogorsky's, which is ultimately from the 1930s, and there's Warren Treadgold's from the 90s. And they're both very long books on a similar scale. The books are on such a scale because this is a very long-lasting civilization, right? It lasts throughout the entirety of the Middle Ages, and it's fairly complex, and so there's a lot to say. People obviously write books of this scale on, just World War I or the Civil Rights Movement, and so here we're dealing with a 1,200-year-old society, and it deserves a long treatment every once in a while. So it is very rare for experts to write this because it doesn't require expertise in lots of different periods and different categories of history, economic, religious, and so forth. And most scholars tend to specialize in one thing or another, and it's rare for someone to try, at least, to maintain a kind of overall view of what was going on. And I've tried to do that in my career. And so a number of people had encouraged me that the time was right to put a new synthesis together. After all, if we're all producing sort of specialized sub-studies and no one ever tries to put it together to see what big picture they're all pointing toward, we kind of lose sight of what we're doing collectively. So I thought the time was right.
And I know I'm probably repeating myself more often than not by saying this, but I want to hear your thoughts on this as well, because the views on Byzantium is actually, I believe it's a fairly recent phenomenon in the early 21st century that people view Byzantine or Eastern Roman history, as we will call it from now on, fairly differently from, say, the 60s scholars or the 20s scholars that you mentioned. That is the view that and again, as I call it, the Gibbonite view, that where they believed that Greeks, were kind of lazy and didn't really contribute anything to history, or didn't really contribute anything. It seems to be a fairly recent study and scholarship on Eastern Roman history.
That's right. So your audience should know that the term Byzantium is a modern, mostly Western European term. It didn't become a term of art. That is a kind of technical term for referring to what most people understand as Byzantium until the late 19th century. So it's not an authentic term at all. And what some of us are trying to do now, with some hopes for success, is to retire that term, because you're right, it is indissolubly linked with some old 19th century, 18th century prejudices against this civilization, many of which are actually of medieval origin. And they tend to stigmatize this civilization as degenerate and in constant decline and having no originality, contributing nothing to, world civilization and so forth. And they did so for, various political reasons that we can talk about. It's not just unfair, it's just a false view. And so because we can't prize the name Byzantium and Byzantine away from those associations, it's better to just retire it as an academic term. Roman is the authentic term. We can qualify it as East Roman. Some people use medieval Roman to distinguish it from ancient Rome, just for the purposes of convention or convenience, though ultimately we have to recognize that these are one and the same civilization in continuous evolution. There are no breaks in it. It's arbitrary to say that Roman history ends at this point and something else
Yeah.
begins afterwards. These are the kinds of politics of the names that we're wrestling with right now. At the moment in my usage, Byzantium is a term that I use in like titles or subtitles of articles just to designate the general field with which I'm engaging, the kind of what part of the world and period I'm talking about. But after that, in the substance of any analysis or narrative that I write, those terms don't appear because they're not accurate representations of anything going on in that period.
Mm. I was with, and we don't have to focus too much on Constantine because I find personally there are other things I find more interesting about this period than Constantine himself. But and I feel like most people already are fairly familiar with him and who he is. We don't have to go into much detail to him. But I want to talk instead of focusing on Constantine. I want to focus on the consequences of moving the capital from Rome to Constantinople or Byzantium as it was then called. So let's talk a little bit about the consequences of moving the capital from Rome to Constantinople.
Right. Well, it wasn't so much a move as a duplication. In other words, Rome itself in Italy never ceased to be an imperial capital in some ways or others, nor did it lose its great historical, even symbolic significance at the time when Constantine created Constantinople in the East. Constantinople was understood as a kind of new Rome, that is a kind of duplicate, a Rome for the East, so that the eastern half of the empire had its own Rome. And this was the result of a number of developments that had already occurred, specifically the extension of Roman citizenship to everyone in the empire, the increasing importance of the eastern half of the empire in terms of wealth and manpower and elites and cities and so forth. And
And we kind of see this when when Diocletian divides the empire in two, right? So we kind of
right.
always start to see that Rome kind of become less and less important over there at this point.
Yeah, Rome itself was not very close to the imperial areas of activity, which are normally the frontiers in this period. And so even in the western half, emperors tended to reside in places like Milan or Trier and so forth. In the east, Constantinople is kind of halfway between the Danube frontier and the Euphrates frontier, so emperors could move, back and forth, or their generals could, or it was a convenient capital in between those 2 points. So Constantinople consolidated the interests and careers of Roman elites from all over the Eastern Mediterranean in a way that created greater coherence to the eastern half of the empire and prevented it from breaking at the Bosporus point. So, right, so geographically, the Roman Empire straddles, Europe and Asia and Africa. And the point where Europe and Asia meet, which is the Bosporus, Sea of Marmara, the Hellespont, and so on, is this rupture point where the Roman Empire tended to break into pieces. So if you look at prior civil wars from the time of Augustus onward, there is this tendency for the East to break off during the Civil War. And increasingly, the focal point of those civil wars was the city of Byzantium, was the Bosporus. And by creating a capital there, this united the Balkan provinces with Asia Minor and Syria, and it definitely created a very stable, long-lasting sort of clamp holding those territories together. What happened in the end, of course, is that the Roman Empire broke just further west. It broke where the Eastern and the Western empires divided their territories, and they're basically the Adriatic and the Ionian Sea. But for the purposes for which it was built, it was very successful as a consolidation of Roman power and a forum for Eastern Roman elites to come together and govern their half of the empire. And that's what it did for the next 1,000 years.
Mm. And instead of focusing, I want to skip a little bit ahead because I want to focus on, before we go there, I actually want to talk about the Christianization of the Eastern Roman Empire, because it wasn't like, oh, Constantine Christian and snap your fingers, we're Christian now. It was a fairly slow progress, even after Constantine. It wasn't like I said,
Right.
it wasn't like
Right.
that.
Yes, well, I mean, by Constantine's time, Christianity had been around for 300 years, and which is, the time that separates us from, Louis XIV.
Mm.
Um, and it was still a very small minority in the empire. And scholars sort of disagree about how small a minority. The most optimistic estimate is around 10%, but there are scholars who argue for much smaller numbers even than that. And those numbers were concentrated in the cities, not in the countryside where most of the population lived. And it took another 100 years after Constantine for Christianity to even become a majority religion. Obviously, that was a much, much faster expansion. So if you think about it, 3 centuries to go from 0 to, let's say, 10%, and then another century to get to 50%, that's a huge leap in a century. But of course, this happens in a context of imperial support and favoritism shown toward the version of Christianity that the emperors support, coupled with very discriminatory practices toward everyone else. Sometimes verging on persecution, not quite, but definitely the structure of incentives was to do what the emperor said. Normally, subjects of the Roman Empire went along with whatever the emperor said. So when the emperor started saying, we'll be Christian and support Christians, people suddenly discovered that it was very advantageous to be Christian. So there was a rapid conversion after that. But that's to reach 50%. So there's still another 50% to go. And that took another century or so. And obviously, we don't have statistics or data from all of this. These are estimates. During the 5th century, by about 500, we reach a situation where non-Christians are a small minority.
Mm.
So yeah, it takes a while. People are, so overall, we're talking about 500 years to convert
Yeah.
the Roman. This is a very long time. It's not fast
I
at
mean,
all.
compare this to Islam, which only took a few decades to convert.
Oh no, Islam is actually quite comparable. So
Mm.
when the Arabs conquer the Middle East,
Yeah.
it took about 3 centuries for, let's say, most regions on average to
Because they were
become.
quite reluctant to convert people because of tax reasons, right?
They didn't actively want to convert people. People converted because there were,
Yeah.
advantages. It took about 3 centuries for the areas under Muslim control to become, let's say, 50% or slight majority Muslim, which is, again, an astonishingly long time, given that in this situation, Muslims are, in fact, the dominant social group. They are in charge. They're the rulers, so all of the prestige and incentives are with them. And yet it still takes a very long time. But you're right, they didn't actually incentivize conversion by their subjects. And then it takes more centuries for these countries to even become mostly Muslim.
We
That
will
country is
discuss Islam, of course, later in this episode. But I want to talk a little bit about as well, because as you know, before Christianity, then before the emperors became Christian, of course, the emperor was considered God, and I'm a God, and not. And so, how let's talk about the process from actually being a God to being God's representative instead of just being proclaimed a God, and let's talk about that process there.
Oh, these distinctions are never as so precise as
Mm.
sometimes scholars write about them this way, but it was never so clear cut as the distinction between being a god and being representative of a god and so forth. In other words, before Christianization, yeah, emperors were sort of gods, but most people knew they were
Yeah.
men as well.
Oh,
There
help, I'm becoming a god.
Yes, that sort of thing. There was also some subtle ways in which, even in the imperial cult, it was kind of understood that you're praying on behalf of the emperors, not to the emperors. And I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which ritual and speech, sort of signify that, yeah, this is a different category of thing. Likewise, after Christianization, emperors continue to be treated with the same kind of sort of divine reverence that they had once been treated, and they continue to be called divus this and divus that, and the imperial palace and the administration and so on are divinae and sacrae and so forth. So emperors never quite lose this divine aura that lingered about them. Well into the Byzantine period, like 11th century, they talk about the emperor as a god and so forth, and in non-metaphorical language. Now, of course, if you pressed any of these people, like theologically, do you mean that the emperor is God? Now, of course, they would say no, but for all intents and purposes, they talked about them and treated them with this kind of divine aura. So there isn't some clear-cut switch from one kind of model to another. They kind of blur into each other, and they're both present in most of the, before and after Christianization. It's only really if you ask people like, no, now we're talking, hard theology, and so then they have to switch codes, and then you would start getting these kinds of distinctions. But that's only in theological writings. I don't think it affected how most people responded to the emperor's power.
And of course, not all emperors were. It was some emperors were reluctant as well, of course, in becoming Christian as well. So I want to talk a little bit, of course. I'm not sure you know who I'm referring to here, Julian, of course, who were very reluctant. So it should read, and it's interesting because as you know, as a historian, if you don't have necessarily have to be a bad ruler, just if you had picked off rub a few people in the court for where they didn't write bad about it, as is the case with Julian, as you write about, he didn't seem like a bad emperor just because he was pagan, he got a bad rap. But I found it intriguing the way you wrote about Julian. I just not as a ludicrous pagan, but he was actually seen to be a decent emperor, even if though he reigned just really briefly.
Why would a pagan emperor be presumed to be not decent?
I mean, didn't Christians writers trying to put him down because he was a pagan? Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, well, even those Christian writers who hated his guts, nevertheless, many of them continue to acknowledge that their own Christian congregations, like their own fellow Christians, admired Julian because he was a good emperor. And the reason why they wrote such vicious stuff against him is because many Christians thought he was a perfectly good emperor. That's one of the interesting insecurities of the Christian literature about him. But Julian is an interesting figure for all kinds of reasons, not because his reign was sort of, historically consequential. I mean, as you said, he was emperor for only 18 months. Most of the things that he tried to do were either reversed or failed or didn't have time to catch on. So it's not for that reason. It's because he disrupted the system. He disrupted the trajectory that imperial Christianization was on. And by disrupting it, he caused this, he allows us to see things that would have happened much more quietly. He drew attention to them. He forced Christians to discuss certain things explicitly that they would have preferred not to. Like, for example, how Christian elites were appropriating classical learning. And he forced them to think about, wait, this classical learning is full of all of this paganism. How are you taking it over as Christians with a good conscience? And other questions like this. And so he's interesting as a disruptive moment, not as a sort of historically consequential one.
And I know I'm skipping. We don't have time to go through 1,000 years history in a couple of hours, so I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. And I want to talk because this is kind of I would say a red line in throughout your book as well, the Council of Chalcedon. And do forgive me for saying this wrong, but I want to discuss the importance of the Council of Chalcedon a little bit.
Well, let me ask you, what kind of importance do you come away thinking that it had, having read the book? So, I mean,
And
Why would you ask the question?
I feel that because it's do forgive me, I don't have anything smart to say. That's why I'm asking you about because I want because it's what I'm sorry, but if I stumble a little bit, but I don't really have much to say. I'm sadly on the council, but I want you to hear your opinion and hear your thoughts on the council, if you wouldn't mind.
No, not at all. But yeah, I just wanted to engage with any
Yeah,
specific concerns that you
yeah.
had.
I
But
wish I had something smart to say. If I did, I would. But
no,
yeah.
it's not a matter of smart. Okay. So with the exception of the Protestant churches today, most, I'm going to say almost all other Christian churches today
Mm.
are the product of a decision for or against the Council of Chalcedon, which is a council of bishops that occurred in 451 AD at Chalcedon, which was across the straits from Constantinople. It's essentially Constantinople. So today it's it's not even a suburb of Istanbul. It's well inside the city of Istanbul. And it was incredibly controversial and divisive. And immediately, bishops and priests and lay Christians and monks, set about deciding whether they were for it or against it. And this divided the church at the time and society to a certain degree. And ever since then, churches are divided on whether they accept or reject the Council of Chalcedon. So, for example, the Catholic and Orthodox churches accept it. Georgians and the Caucasus accept it, but other churches, such as Coptic Church in Egypt, most Armenians and Syrian Orthodox, Ethiopians, and so on, do not accept Chalcedon. And this is one of the fundamental splits in the Christian church, and it goes back to that point. And some scholars might view this primarily as a theological question. And in fact, this is how it used to be treated. So the Council of Chalcedon, it did many things, but one of the things that it did was produce a creed that is a formulation of Christian doctrine, specifically regarding the question of natures, that is, the human and the divine natures of Jesus Christ being both human and divine, but how? How are those two things connected? They're like antithetical things, right? So how can they be part of the same person?
If I may ask, what's this kind of a continuation of the Council of Nicaea and with Constantine in a way?
Well, both sides claim that they are continuations of Nicaea. All sides except Nicaea. What they disagreed about was whether Chalcedon was a compatible with Nicaea or antithetical with Nicaea, and both say that their side is right and the other side is wrong. That's the nature. That's the rhythm of Christian history, right? All Christian groups regard themselves as orthodox and right, and regard all other groups as wrong. That's just how it is. Which is why the term orthodox is kind of useless. Orthodox means correct faith, right? Correct belief, and all Christian groups believe that they have the correct faith, and so they're all orthodox in their own eyes. Be that as it may. So there is a theological question about the natures. Are they two sort of coexisting kind of parallel natures in a way, or are they fused into one sort of nature? And both sides faces enormous theological and logical problems. Both sides. Neither side is obvious in any way. However, more recent scholarship has found that the dispute over Chalcedon, while often framed in theological terms, was something much more like what we would call a culture war today. That is, people taking sides for, non-theological reasons. Most people did not understand the theological issues. Most theologians today cannot explain the theological differences. If you come across anybody who claims that they can, they're usually partisans of one side or another. That is, they believe that one side is right, and so they have to be able to give an account of it. But for the most part, it's very difficult to explain what the difference is. Today, with access to all of our, learning and resources, it was impossible for most people then. So they were taking sides for other reasons. So in similar ways to, various culture wars that you find online where people are sort of fanatically fighting for one side or another, but it's not because of the sort of quote unquote science behind the issue. And so this divided society, or a considerable part of society, for some time. And it was a very important social issue. There are a lot of people who were interested in this. Unlike later theological or religious controversies in the empire, that are sometimes given equal sort of space, like iconoclasm in the 8th and 9th centuries, or hesychasm in the 14th century. In my reading of the sources, those two controversies excited almost no popular interest and participation, like zero. Whereas the controversy over Chalcedon demonstrably drew in thousands of people, clergy and laity and monks, into sort of passionate controversy, and sort of society was divided in some ways. So that's why I devoted more space to it than to the later ones.
Now, again, do forgive me if I'm jumping too far ahead, but we have a lot of stuff to go through. And next
We don't
one,
have to go through everything. So
no,
let
of course.
me stop you. Let me stop you there. This is a very long history. It includes many continents, many languages, many periods of history, social changes, wars, empires, and so there's no way that we can go through everything. I'm just hoping that we're not going
I
to be
wish we
here for
had
10
time,
hours.
but
No. There is no time to cover. So
yeah.
anyone who's interested in more can actually just go read the book.
Yeah.
We can discuss a few issues here to give them a sampler, but it's really a very rich history. I mean, it really repays study.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I wanted to say.
Absolutely. And next, of course, I want to discuss, and we don't go through some of the most important stuff that happened in this episode in the Empire. And one of the more important is, and because you had a rather interesting view on Justinian compared to some other scholars and Saris, for example, who written a biography on him recently. You have a different view from others on. You seem to be a little more skeptical and use Procopius as more as a source for Justinian's reign. So what's your let's talk a little bit about your view on Justinian's reign.
Wait, I'm skeptical and use
No,
Procopius?
I mean you're a bit more. You don't. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I mean you use Procopius more than other scholars. Some from what I have read on the topic are more
I don't.
skeptical to him than
I'm sorry.
you seem to be.
I don't think that can possibly be true. I don't think that there's any
Forgive me if I
scholar.
screwed up the question, but
Well, let me be precise here. I don't think there's any scholar who works on Justinian these days who does not extensively use Procopius. It's just impossible to avoid using the major a source for the reign, apart perhaps from the emperor's own laws. Some scholars use Procopius more than the laws. Some use the laws more than Procopius. I think in this book I use the laws more than Procopius when I'm trying to access Justinian's policies. Now, the question then might be how skeptical one is of Procopius. And everyone is skeptical of Procopius to some degree or another. I don't know if I'm more or less skeptical than other scholars. I'm skeptical about a lot of things in Procopius as a historical source. I'm less skeptical about other things. I'm honestly not sure that I can quantify it. Even scholars who claim to be very skeptical of Procopius, you will find them relying on Procopius implicitly in many parts of their reconstruction. Not just Peter, but like everybody. It's not.
What are your thoughts, if I may interrupt you? What are your thoughts on Justinian's reign as a whole and the importance of Justinian as an emperor?
So I have a number of chapters on Justinian because it was a very sort of busy and consequential period. There's a lot going on, and I don't have one view of Justinian because he was active in so many domains, from wars to laws to building to administration to whatever. And so, I can't boil it down to a single formula. But if I were to pick some of the major controversies about the reign of Justinian and take a side on them, I would say, so for example, that when it comes to the wars, I think they were generally more successful during Justinian's reign, but in the long term, very damaging to the empire's strategic interests. And here I differ with some scholars who believe that they were not so harmful in the long term. I think they were. As for the plague, I tend to be persuaded more by scholars who argue for a more moderate impact of the plague than the more sort of maximalist impact. And I have my own reasons for that. And when it comes to the administration, I believe that Justinian was trying to, he was a bit of a micromanager. There's no denying that. I don't think anybody denies that. And I think he was trying to squeeze more revenue out of his subjects after a certain point because he simply had more expenses with the walls and the and all the buildings. Sorry, not walls, wars and buildings and so forth. And so when it comes to controversies about that, I would say that I am not persuaded by actually fairly older scholarship, which saw the empire during Justinian's reign as kind of falling apart into sort of having seeing administrative collapse as sort of regional provincial elites become more powerful and are kind of ignoring or pushing back the administration. I don't think that ever happened. I don't think there's any evidence for that. I think quite the contrary, what we see is Justinian's administration pushing even deeper into provincial life, trying to organize it according to imperial interests, to squeeze more revenue out of it, to streamline procedures. So I see this as a period of more maximalist administrative penetration rather than sort of the rise of feudal landed elites who are dismembering the states. I don't see any evidence for that. There's an older view that you sometimes find in the scholarship about that. I think Justinian was trying to do more, but often trying to do it with fewer resources. So it creates all of these problems that Procopius is ultimately reflecting.
It is if I understood this correctly, part of your argument for what the Great War under Heraclion was that when under Justinian's campaign, he pulled resources away from the border with Persia and focused instead on the Italian campaign that weakened the point on the border with Persia. So it kind of was a little bit of setup, if you will, for the Great War with the Khusro II.
That's right, because in the toward the end of the 6th century, already by Justinian's time, you have challenges by major powers such as the Persians and the Avars, Persians on the Euphrates border and Avars on the Danube border. And in the meantime, Justinian had shifted a great deal of the armed strength of the empire to Italy and North Africa, and a little bit to Spain. And so the traditional borders of the Eastern Empire found themselves sort of undermanned when it came to their defenses. I think that definitely happened, and I think the numbers bear it out.
So let's talk about it, because it's one of the and there is of course a great book on this by James Howard Johnson as well, who's written about the Great War. But let's talk a little bit about the Great War and the impact it had on the Eastern Roman Empire.
Well, in contrast to most scholars who work on this war, I tried to pay less attention to the actual events of the war, the fighting, though I do, and more to the impact that it had. And here I found myself in disagreement with some recent scholarship, which has tried to poo-poo the war and suggest that it wasn't very impactful on the lives of provincials, that it wasn't very destructive, that it was, as one scholar put it, a bump in the road and nothing more, and that most people got along with their lives. And I found that all of the evidence contradicts this picture. It was highly destructive to provincial life in terms of death, slaughter, thousands of refugees, but also prisoners of war being carted off to Persia to work on agricultural estates or mines or whatever. Cities stripped down. The population under Persian occupation was fleeced, and lived under this arbitrary military occupation that they couldn't politically control. It wasn't their own government. and that the whole experience was highly destructive, and a period of tremendous uncertainty and hardship for the people who found themselves in this war zone. So there's so much evidence about this. It's kind of overwhelming, and I'm a little bit baffled by the trend in a lot of modern scholarship to assume that conquests in pre-modern empires are relatively sort of anodyne, and nothing to see here. There's one empire replacing another, nothing changed on the ground. No, this was extremely destructive and damaging to the lives of people who got caught in these kinds of wars, and it definitely mattered to people who ruled them. They were not at all indifferent to it, as some historians suggest.
And
So, yeah.
sorry if I interrupted you again, but I just wanted to bring up as well. We discussed this in the live stream we had recently, that the Great War as well. It was made the conquest of Islam as well, the rise of Islam so rapidly. That's because of this war. It was easy for Islam to rise the amount of power and become this great caliphate that we see later on. It's a consequence of the war.
Exactly. This war was so destructive to both sides ultimately, that it made it very, very much easier for the Arabs to conquer what they did in the 7th century. But everybody has known this and acknowledged it. However, this has been acknowledged at the level of like military infrastructure and armies and so forth. I want to emphasize that this is something that impacted populations all the way down to the village level. It wasn't just confined to the level of high strategy.
Now, do you think, I want to ask a hypothetical question, and do you think that if the Great War had not happened, that Islam would rise as rapidly as it did? And I mean, the kind of discussed this early on, but that the Islamization wasn't really that rapid. But do you think the caliphates would have risen? So I should probably say instead, do you think the caliphates would have risen so rapidly had the Great War not happened?
It's an interesting question. It's actually two questions. So I think Islam would have risen the way it did because Islam arose in Arabia through processes that don't seem to have much to do with what was going on in Roman society. This was an Arabian development, and by 630 or so, the movement of Islam had managed to more or less consolidate Arabia for the most part, and that's one development that I'm not sure how much it would have been affected by their peace between Rome and Persia. On the other hand, it's very likely that there wouldn't have been a caliphate. The most that the Arabs could muster, even at the peak of so in the 630s, was maybe 25,000 men, which was the size of a Roman field army. If Rome was at peace and still had its field armies, there's no reason why it couldn't have, and also Persia. I mean, there's no way that one army could have defeated both Rome and Persia if they were at peace and with all of their defenses in place. Like that's a hard sell. So that would not have happened, and then history would have gone in a very, very different direction. But anyone's guess is as good as mine of what that would be.
And before we go on to Iconoclasm, I want to discuss relations between the West and the East, because as you thought, that's also an important aspect of your book, because even though the Western world kind of, like we talked about in the beginning, it kind of begin to look at the Greek as kind of a little bit degenerate. In the Eastern half didn't really care much and give much thought or hatred towards the West, as you talked about in your book as well. So let's talk a little bit about relations and how it sours and in between Eastern Roman Empire and the Western world.
In what period exactly? This is a major.
In general terms, how the relationship became from that, how for lack of a better word, hatred between the West and the East.
Where do you see the hatred? I'm just curious.
Maybe not hatred is the right word, but dislike is perhaps a better term for it.
I'm going to have to say this question is a bit too broad for me to answer here.
Okay. That's fair enough.
Because it's a story of 1,000 years. And and it involves like everything in both Eastern and Western European history. So I'm not sure where to start even.
Mm.
Yes.
Definitely an episode in itself then, that's
Yeah, for
right.
sure.
So instead, let's talk about iconoclasm and how the worship, how it occurred, and I want to hear your thoughts on art and kind of saint worshipping. And I don't know if this is a stupid question, but it's in a way, from my kind of point of view, the ideal worship with saints and relics, so many relics and saints, it's kind of in a way is little bit like paganism. Do you feel that what do you see it like that? Like the ideal worship of relics and artifacts and arts is kind of maybe in a way, and of course that's like probably one of the reasons why Iconoclasm happened, right? But do you feel like it was kind of a little bit paganism in this?
Well, this is what the so-called iconoclast
Yeah.
emperors thought. I mean, they believed that all of this business with icons is an extension of the history of ancient idolatry, and they said so. So clearly they thought so, and insofar as they were able to carry apparently a good part of East Roman society with them without much objection, other people must have thought, well, yeah, I guess the emperors know what they're talking about. Other people objected to that. Obviously, no one today is going to make that argument. In other words, that the Christian veneration, not of this. So let's be clear about the terminology here. So you said worship of saints. That's not actually what's going on. No, neither side would claim that that's what's going on. Worship is something that properly goes to God and only to God. What happens with the saints is what's called veneration, which is like an religious honor being given to them, and that this can be done, said the iconophiles, through their images. So the presence of the image of the saint, or even of Christ, can help the believer, right, to channel or transfer their veneration or worship, depending on who is involved, toward the archetype, the person or figure behind the image. And the this doesn't even correspond to what Christians thought about pagan worship. So the Christian polemic on paganism was that the pagans actually worship the things, the statues, the whatever. Of course, this is polemic, and some Christian bishops were honest enough to admit that that's not really what was going on. But so there is, Christians at least draw this kind of distinction between venerating the saint through an image versus worshiping the thing itself. But iconoclasts thought that that distinction was perhaps a little bit too fine, and that Christians were kind of lapsing into quasi-idolatrous behavior and thinking, that way. But I mean, obviously, scholars today would not make that accusation. It kind of, this is something perhaps that Protestants used to say about Catholics and Orthodox people. Like it's part of a modern polemic of sort of religious sectarianism, that Catholicism is like paganism and so forth. And Protestant groups have histories of iconoclasm themselves, and so for a while, Byzantine iconoclasm was considered a kind of forerunner of modern Protestantism and all these kinds of things. But today, scholars kind of stay away, I think probably correctly, from that kind of conceptual contamination, and we just look at the event in its own context, because obviously Romans of the 8th and 9th century are not thinking about Protestants and Catholics and so forth. They're just dealing with their own world. And it's very difficult to know in the 8th century, especially, what was going on. We don't even know what Leo III, who started this whole thing, was thinking, or even said. We don't have the alleged decree, and we don't even know what it said or what its provisions was. We just don't know. The 8th century is accessed today almost entirely through iconophile polemic, which is grossly distorted, just totally unreliable when it comes to what was happening in the 8th century. It would be like trying to understand the presidency of Barack Obama by reading the most virulent racist right-wing blogs on the internet. And it's like you're not even going to understand what was going on. Anyway, did I answer the question, or was there something?
I think you did fairly well. Yeah, I think you did fairly well, because something that is interesting as well is that it actually happened twice. Iconoclasm, first Iconoclasm, then it's broken up, and then again it happened twice in very short span of time. But of course, then it never happened again after the second time.
Yeah, well, there is a dynamic here which has to do with imperial victory. In other words, when emperors do things, and this is a movement that was begun by emperors and settled by emperors both ways. This is not a issue on which there was much popular interest, like I said. This is emperors all the way down. And when emperors do things, it is almost always because they think it will help their regime, create a better image for them, but also sort of secure victory and success by doing what they think God wants. After all, this is the whole point of sort of Christian imperial ideology. And to that degree, the first iconoclast emperors were successful. Leo III, Constantine V are very successful emperors. And so the fact that they are promulgating iconoclasm and being very successful emperors, like even on the battlefield, for most people, this is like, that's a slam dunk. Like, yes, okay, that's clearly what God wants. They're on the right track. They know what they're doing. Fine. Then Irene reverses this position and restores icons, or actually imposes, puts icons where they might not have been before. And then for a generation, they just keep having defeat after defeat. And so a lot of people, especially in the army, are thinking, wait a minute, with Constantine V, we had this very successful policy. The core of the army is like, this iconoclastic group. And, they're thinking, well, we were doing pretty well while we had iconoclasm. And then, Irene took over, and then there's all these other emperors who are sort of in her shadow, and they're not doing so well. They're like losing battle after battle. And so it makes sense for someone eventually to say, we should probably go back to that other formula that was working better. And that's what Leo V did. And he was an army guy, followed by another army guy and his son. So there is this kind of imperial victory aspect to the argument as well.
Of course, the next big thing that happens is the Crusades, and we don't have to spend too much time on the Crusades, but I do want to as well talk a little bit about the Fourth Crusade, which of course will spark the long decline of the Eastern Roman Empire.
Can you repeat that again? What about the Crusades and the long decline?
We don't have to talk too much about the Crusades, but we can talk a little bit about the Crusades, and of course the Fourth Crusade. I feel like we should. I would kind of feel like the fourth one is the most important in the terms of the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire in general. But I want to talk a little bit about the Crusades first, and then we can start about the decline of the Eastern Roman Empire afterwards, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, the Crusades are another one of these topics that is just vast. Even the topic of the Crusades and the Eastern Empire is kind of vast. So I'm not sure that I can just give a pithy, 3-minute whatever overview.
Take as much time as you want.
The Crusades are this very interesting and possibly unique moment where armies from one part of the world were choosing to march across the territory of the Eastern Empire to attack an enemy on the other side. And this is not something that usually happens in history, right? For an army to march through a sort of neighboring state in order to go reach someone on the other side who is but completely foreign and different to the East Roman society. So that it's an interesting phenomenon in itself, but it also is such as to produce obvious frictions. Like you can't see how that might happen without causing problems. Large armies moving through territories always cause problems, if not for any other reason, just through the sheer logistics of feeding and housing them. And in the long run, that's going to create friction, and it did. So there is, on the one hand, the problems that might be caused by the general ideology of the Crusades and the fake news that they generated. The Crusades are one of the great fake news generators in all of history. So Western Europe came to believe a whole host of false things about the Eastern Empire through Crusade literature. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there is the actual lived experience of these Western armies marching through East Roman lands and the various ways in which that played out. It could have played out beneficially, and the First Crusade did. Alexius, we talked about this. Alexius actually managed to organize that quite well. But later, Crusades tended to produce more friction. And so it was not a story that was going to end happily, probably either way.
I mean, I want to ask, do we know when, because it wasn't called the first or second or third or fourth crusade at the time. So when did that term begin to apply that, oh, this was the first crusade happened between then and this, and then second, blah, 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 blah.
Oh, I've read about this, but I no longer remember the answer to your question. It's a good question. It was not in the Middle Ages, I think.
I want to as well, because the fourth crusade is more important, very important to turning point in Byzantine history. So sorry, Eastern Roman history. I keep saying Byzantine for some reason. So let's talk a little bit about again the impact of the fourth crusade and how the fourth crusade, because they were supposed to say to Egypt, but then they ended up in Constantinople and Cedar. It's a long story, but let's talk a little bit about how the fourth crusade kind of changed, I would say, the world in a way, at least European history.
Well, obviously a lot has been written about this, and your audience is presumably familiar with the main outline of events. So I won't go over those. I'll say that it's pretty clear to my mind that whatever the intentions of the architects of the Fourth Crusade, and by the way, I do not believe that they were benign or neutral. The Fourth Crusade was essentially an act of Western European colonialism in the Aegean region. And it is part of a long trajectory of Western European colonialism that reaches into modern times with no break from then. Actually, from probably what we call the First Crusade and even a little bit before that. But what happened in the Aegean region was classic colonialism. So where you have an army that marches in and essentially sort of decapitates the military and political leadership of native lands that it then conquers, allocates to its own supporters, and then begins to reorient local economies in such a way as to either link them up with the colonial metropole or to benefit the colonists at the time when they're also issuing appeals and invitations for more colonists to come and settle. Meanwhile, the natives are reduced to second level status or worse, and are rarely or never really allowed to join the sort of ruling group, which consists very consistently of Western European types. And the laws and social structures are reformatted accordingly to create an underclass of natives who are subjected to more or less arbitrary authorities. That's pretty much a sort of classic definition of colonialism, with all of its attendant, sort of racist and sexual rhetoric of subjugation and so forth. Now, the interesting thing is that scholars of this period don't talk about it in that way, for a number of reasons. Historians of the Crusades are very reluctant, not all of them. Some are quite candid about what this was, but some of them are very reluctant to call these acts of colonialism. And there are, I think, some religious biases that play in here. Also, Byzantinians have not generally engaged. I mean, they are now, but very, very belatedly with studies of colonial domination to talk about what was going on here. It's also difficult. So one of the differences is that the East Romans were, I mean, obviously they were a very developed and sophisticated society, an older society already, in the same way that sort of India was when the British conquered it. But they managed to fight back very successfully for the most part and fairly quickly. So what was an act of colonial conquest was very quickly reduced to a bunch of colonial outposts that were very vulnerable in the face of both East Roman resurgence and then later also the Ottoman conquest. So that within a couple of centuries, there are just a few of these outposts left. Cyprus, Crete, some bits of the Peloponnese, the Ionian Islands, some islands. So it was overall a not very successful colonization, but colonization it was nonetheless.
But something that people may not be familiar in the Fourth Crusade is that the establishment of the Trebizond Empire that would last until the 1460s, even after Constantinople fell. So let's talk a little bit about the establishment of Trebizond.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting development, because what the Fourth Crusade did, it was it broke the East Roman world into pieces, involuntarily, of course. No East Romans, and this is something that anyone who works on this society has to understand at the outset. At no point did the East Romans decide to partition their state or break it up into pieces. This happened fairly often in medieval times. It happened to the Carolingian Empire. It happened to various caliphates. It happened to the Mongol Empire. It happened, all the time. This never happens in East Roman history. Romans never reach the point where they decide to partition or even break off from the main polity governed by Constantinople. But the Fourth Crusade forces precisely such a fragmentation, which was extremely.
No, if I may ask about this, was there, and of course this wasn't really a term back then, it would be a term in the 19th century, but to use the modern term, was there a sense of nationalism in the Eastern Roman Empire, to use the modern, and of course it wasn't a term back then, but would you say there was kind of a nationalistic pride in being a Roman?
National pride, not nationalistic or nationalism. That's a different process. Nationalism is something that is a process that exists in a modern framework because it has to do with the plurality of states that are whatever. And this is not exactly what's going on, but national, yes, absolutely. National, ethnic, and also religious and cultural pride in the sense of distinctiveness among the East Romans, absolutely. This is documented in every period of their history. And after the Fourth Crusade, there's very much an understanding that the East Romans have to regroup and reunify into one state and drive the Latins out. And they're all bent on it. The problem is that you have competing centers of Roman power that are trying to do this. And so it never manages to fully gel. And the Empire of Trebizond is one of those splinters. There's some indication that the Komneni who began to rule in Trebizond after 1204 wanted to be the ones to reunify the whole thing, right? Not to remain, sort of safe and secluded behind the mountains of the Pontus, but rather to move west quickly and push the Latins out and retake and reconstitute the Eastern Empire. But they fail in this in the first years, and they are pushed back, and so they remain content to rule their corner, this northeastern corner of the East Roman world, which they do for 2.5 more centuries. So this is an interesting development and almost a kind of historical laboratory where you can see what happens when a kind of splinters, not separatist Roman state, because they don't want to be separate necessarily, but de facto just kind of the vicissitudes of history. This is just kind of how it played out, and eventually it becomes its own state. The same thing that happens in Epirus, which, is between Nicaea and Epirus is the one that doesn't take Constantinople, and it ideologically accepts the normativity of a single Roman state and a single emperor, and subordinates itself in theory to the emperors of Constantinople after the Nicaea takes back the capital, but not really in practice, because by that point they'd already developed their own sort of native leadership cadres and traditions and so on. And it's unclear what they thought they were, that is in Nicaea. Even in Trebizond, it's a little unclear what they thought this state was, though there's good indications that their emperors domestically, their rulers, call themselves, Basileus of the Romans, and consider their subjects to be Romans. The majority of the population of Trebizond and Epirus were Romans, so there were plenty of other groups living in those states. So the Fourth Crusade forces the Romans into these very uncomfortable and uncharted ideological and practical situations, which makes this period somewhat fascinating in its own right. So it's not the unified Roman state that we have until that point, but rather all of these competing splinters. And that like Julian, right? Like Julian, who disrupts things and therefore reveals things, the Fourth Crusade does the same thing. One of the things it reveals is exactly just how passionate and committed the Romans are to the unity of their society and their culture.
Let's talk about the retaking of and kicking the Latins out of Constantinople and the end of the Latin, and for lack of better words, Latin Empire in these.
What about it exactly?
Let's talk about the retaking of Constantinople, and of course the beginning of the. I would say this is kind of the beginning of the end for the Roman, a long, long, slow decline.
Well, so the Latin states that were established after the Fourth Crusade, a great many of them did not last past 1 or 2 generations. Thessaloniki, like 20 years. Constantinople was a bit longer, 50 some years. And many of them were equally short-lived. So the Romans managed to, mop those up. Others were much more long-lasting, like Venetian Crete, or Lusignan Cyprus, or some of the islands. And anyway, but the reconquest of Constantinople was pretty much by chance, though it was likely going to fall anyway. Let me back up. So the main reason why the Latin Empire of Constantinople was always weak and was destined to fall, there's no way they could have survived much longer, is because in typical Latin fashion, when the Crusaders took Constantinople, they set down to divide all of its territories among all of the little feudal lords and barons and dukes and whatever. And so they started distributing all of the territories among themselves. And the territories that were allotted to the Latin emperor in Constantinople were primarily those of Asia Minor. But they never took Asia Minor because the Empire of Nicaea, the Roman state of Nicaea, kept those for itself and pretty much pushed the Latins out. So the Latin emperor found himself as the nominal head of this feudal hierarchy in the Aegean region, but without very much, like personal or, resources. And so the Latin emperor had to keep being bailed out by his feudal underlings, especially the Prince of Achaia, the Peloponnese, who on a couple of occasions sort of sailed to the rescue of Constantinople. So this was not a formula for long-term success, and no wonder that it failed. In fact,
Did most of the guys, soldiers, just pack their bags and go home after the conquest of Constantinople as well? Like they just kind of, okay, we did it, let's just kind of go home now.
well, yes, the leadership of the Latin Empire did, but most of the Latins who were resident there stayed there. Michael VIII Palaiologos, who was the East Roman emperor at the time, he and his subjects were not interested in reprisals. There were no massacres or anything like that. In fact, there's a text which says that the Latins can stay in Constantinople if they want, so long as they're quiet. That means no agitating on behalf of Catholic conversion, no, agitating to return the, Western emperor and so on. And there's no evidence that they did that. They just got along with their lives under East Roman rule. But the leadership cadres definitely fled, and they went back to Italy, where they quickly began to hatch schemes to retake Constantinople, which lasted for maybe another 40 some years. They continued to be a threat because they were organizing armies to, quote, retake Constantinople and enforce their alleged claims to it. So they were a problem. But no, Michael VIII managed to reconstitute most of it. He and his predecessor, Ioannis III, Vatadzis, between the two of them, they managed to put back most of the empire together. The decline that you mentioned earlier, that came from a completely different direction, and it had nothing to do with any of this. That had to do with the movement of Turkmen tribes into Asia Minor, pushed there by the Mongols. This is a completely different story, having to do with the Mongol overlordship of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum in Asia Minor, and the chaos that it caused, and the openings that it not only created openings, but it actually forced all of these armed bands of nomadic warriors into Asia Minor. And
If I
these are
may
the
say
ones
so, it's
that
kind of a mirror of kind of what happened in the fourth century, the fifth century, right? Of the Gothic tribe enforced by the Huns from an instant. It kind of seems to mirror the exact same thing that happened to the fall of, and maybe way off here, but it kind of sounds a little bit similar to the what would happen in the Western Roman Empire as happening now.
I'd have to think about that. Certainly not with the Huns. So the Huns in the 5th century didn't actually conquer any part of the Roman Empire. They were usually, the Huns had a different
But
MO.
they didn't
They were,
push the Goths further in towards,
in
towards
that
Roman
sense. So
territory.
the Mongols are more like the Huns. Yeah. In that sense, sure, fair enough. Yeah, in that sense, yes. Right. So the loss of Asia Minor in the last 20 years of the 13th century, that's when I think a process of largely irreversible decline sets in. So after that point.
Hmm. Let's talk about the rise of the Ottomans and their conquering territories and how they would eventually come in, of course, to 1453.
You're going to have to be more specific, because that also is a huge topic with
Yeah,
enormous
I
bibliography.
mean, because of course, as you know, the Ottomans would be the cause for later on, and when you mentioned that how the Turkmens were pushed in, so let's talk a little bit about how Osman, and you write a little bit about this in the book as well. So I was thinking we could talk a little bit about uh, a little bit quickly about the rise of the Ottomans and how, but how they would eventually come to, because they do as well as they did try several times to conquer Constantinople, but it's not until Mehmed II that it's finally succeed.
Oh, that's much later. Initially, the Ottomans were just one little, entrepreneurial dynasty in Asia Minor, and there were many of them, and they were competing while at the same time they were, conquering Roman lands or Seljuk lands. And the Ottomans were a small group. They had some initial successes, then some serious setbacks. It took them a long time to get organized enough to be a threat. But what made them different from the other groups, and that perhaps gave them an advantage, was that they were positioned in Bithynia, which is sort of opposite across the Sea of Marmara from Constantinople and Thrace. And so they were positioned in a way to expand into Europe via Thrace, which is not something that the other emirates at the time were able to do much. So once they had consolidated their position in Bithynia, they were able to send raiding parties across to Thrace, also to lend or loan their warriors to the various states that were fighting in the Balkans or to Roman civil wars. And so they were positioned to expand there. And they were also remarkably sort of ideologically flexible, so that the same groups could be hired by a Roman emperor in one year to fight for him in a civil war or against the Bulgarians or whatever. And in the next year, maybe their services were no longer needed. They could then suddenly become holy warriors for Islam and raid Christian lands and gather up slaves and other plunder. So they're very flexible in that regard. Also, we should not underestimate the importance of the slave trade for them and for many of these emirates. A great part of the economy of the dynasties and their warriors is this massive slave trade, where they're taking captives from lands that they're raiding and conquering and selling them, often to Venetian and Genoese slave dealers. So a lot of people are complicit in all of this. And there is a sort of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern slave trade that facilitated the rise of these early nomadic economies.
By the time this episode is released, I'm going to refer to kind of for us in the future, if you will, but we discussed this with Eleanor Yanadra, who is coming on the episode after you, which is next week by this episode's release. And we discussed kind of how the Eastern Roman Empire by the third, I would say, I'm sure you disagree with me, but by the 1350s, I would say that kind of were already, just to use her term, a zombie empire at this point. They were kind of already dead, just there were not much respect for the Eastern Roman Empire as far as I understand, and there you kind of already had this. They just had a very former shell of what it used to be, and there were much to draw on. They seem to be broke at this point, and they seem to, kind of yeah, like I said, they lost a lot of respect, and they were pretty much kind of already dead by the 1350s, late 13th, 14th century.
Oh, sure. In fact, part of the problem that we have in discussing this is the real zombie in this discussion is the term empire. Empire means something in English. It's not what medieval people meant when they said imperium or imperator. It is not, but we pretend that it is or confuse the two. These are very different things. Empire means something in English, and when you look at the East Roman state at any point after 1203, in fact, probably after 1185, it doesn't really look like much of an empire. And the reason for that is that it is not. It is not what in English the word empire means. In fact, it wasn't in other periods of its history as well. Unless we just mean by that a big state. But empire means more than just that. Even when it was big, it wasn't always an empire. It certainly was not an empire after 1185. At no point. It's just convention that we use that term. But by using that term, we confuse the history that we're trying to tell.
And if I may, I don't know if it is a relevant comment as well, but the Romans never called it imperium. The ancient Roman Empire, they called it res publica, so they didn't call it empire in that sense either. So, you know,
Yeah, so the modern term empire in most languages doesn't mean what ancient Romans or anyone in the Middle Ages normally thought an imperium was. So sometimes it could be in the medieval German conception, be that as it may. So when you say that by 1350, the East Rome was a zombie empire, I would say, well, perhaps it was not an empire at all. It was a struggling, very small, regional sort of ethnic kingdom of the Romans, and it was in serious trouble, and it knew that it was. In a certain sense, you know, its history might well have ended by 1400. In other words, it just continues to lose territory, and the Ottomans, you know, create their own empire. And by the 1390s, the Sultan Bayezid was determined to put an end to it, and he blockaded Constantinople for like 8 years. And by all accounts, the city was about to surrender when Bayezid was completely at random defeated by Timur at Ankara. This was an event that no one could have foreseen, though some were hoping for it. And it almost disrupted what looked like the natural trajectory of decline and fall. Like you lose all of your territories and the rival empire besieges your capital and it falls and the story is over. And it would have been over in 1400 or 1402, except that Timur handed it this 50-year extension, which is an interesting little piece of history in its own right.
was the worry that Timur would go to encounter Constantinople at that point?
I think there were some very brief worries about that, but they lasted for a few days because he had other plans.
So let's talk about 1453 and the conquest of Constantinople. I think that's a fairly good ending point for this episode.
Yes, I am actually writing a separate narrative history of that now. So
I'm looking forward to that one.
So your audience will have to wait a little bit more, but I'm reconstructing the events from the sources, which is something that hasn't been done since Runciman in 1965. And a lot has changed in our understanding of these sources since then. And the book will involve a kind of day-by-day account of the siege and strategic analysis of what was going on. And it will present a very different picture, one in which the fall of the city was by no means inevitable in 1453. In fact, the siege was largely a failure until the last few days, and the difference was ultimately made by the cannons.
And again, if I may comment on this, there seem to be some historians that believe that the cannons were more for psychological, and it wasn't really that impactful on the walls, that they weren't as effective as they seemed to be at the time.
Yeah, so that's Marios Philippidis and Walter Hanek in their big book from 10 plus years ago argue this. And it seems to be now a sort of a mainstreaming position. With all due respect to the incredible work that they did on many aspects of the siege, I mean, my work would be impossible without their work. So I acknowledge that. And they were both good friends, and we loved having these debates. But I disagree with them on this question. I think the cannons were the sole reason why Mehmed's soldiers were able to breach the defenses in the way that they did. And in fact, even when you read Marios and Walter's arguments about this, you will see that, I mean, they don't hold up. Anyway, you'll have to wait for the full version of this when it appears.
I'm definitely looking forward to that one. And it wasn't, again, it wasn't as much to say that Rome fell before 76. It's not really true. And it's the last thing I want to talk about is the fall of the Trebizond Empire, because it would last another few years after the fall of Constantinople. So let's talk about the end of Trebizond as well.
Well, Trebizond surrendered a few years later, you know, like, what is it, 8 years later, when Mehmed brought his armies to it, and it looked like there would be another major siege with everything, and they decided to surrender. The ruling dynasty was transported to Constantinople and a little bit later executed. Rather than get into the sort of the history of those events, I will draw your attention to the significantly different impact that it made on history to surrender or to go down fighting. And Constantinople might very well have surrendered in 1402 when it was blockaded by Bayezid. They were about to surrender. But instead, history spared them from that, and they had another chance. And when they had that other chance, they decided to go down fighting, or at least the Constantine the 11th did. And that had dramatic consequences, both for the population of the city of Constantinople, which was all of it enslaved, 100% enslaved and removed from the city. The city was emptied and abandoned for a few days because there was nobody in it.
Can you
which
imagine,
would not have happened.
Can you imagine seeing that site, an abandoned city like Constantinople?
Yes, I have tried to visualize it in my mind in working through these sources, but it definitely happened. It absolutely happened, and it is spectacularly horrific and grim, but it's also a caesura in the history of the city. And this didn't happen in Trebizond, though Mehmet, and he didn't enslave the population, but he relocated a great many of them to wherever he wanted them to go. In the end, it wasn't much less disruptive, but at least they weren't enslaved. So there's this kind of strange balance between, what's good for the population is, surrender. Whereas on the other hand, when it comes to history, Constantine's sacrifice, and he died. He did not, surrender even when he had the choice. Meant that the fall of Constantinople exerts a very different historical pull in our imagination and in history at large.
I mean, in my mind, it is an epic event that is so much going on.
And yes, to the point where it was
It would have been boring just to write about, and he surrendered the city and that's it.
Yes, exactly. He almost sort of redeemed the otherwise unsavory history of his own dynasty with that final act. And it created this, exactly as you put it, this kind of epic, heroic, but also tragic ending to this story that continues to resonate. So much so that, if you look at current Turkish politics, it's and the behavior of someone like Erdogan, who seems to not be himself convinced that Istanbul was conquered, and they have to constantly reconquer it again and again by converting Hagia Sophia and having recreations and celebrations of the conquest, almost to convince themselves that it actually did happen.
Did I not have a May parade on May 29th every year still?
Yeah. So it's almost as if it, this kind of heroic sacrifice created this sort of indelible memory that can't be easily scrubbed out. So in a certain sense, I would say that if you look at the history of the conquest, so Mehmet gains all the glory for sure, but Constantine ended up with more of the honor. And that's kind of how I see the two of them sort of allocating the proceeds of that event in a certain sense. Constantine the 11th was not otherwise a great ruler or anything like that. He was a decent person.
Did he have to take a ferry because he was so broke that he did his own coronation?
Yes, but being broke isn't necessarily a moral attribute. He was a fairly mediocre ruler. He was a decent person by all accounts. Everybody liked him. He had no major flaws, but he was rather mediocre. But by that one act, which we have to admit had terrible consequences for his few remaining subjects, he sort of redeemed his place in history, and he made sure that the end of the Eastern Roman Empire is something that all of posterity would remember.
What are your thoughts that the Ottomans kind of looked at themselves as a successor of the Roman states?
Oh, I don't think that happened. I think that's a myth, and it's become a talking point, but I think that is so incredibly minor point of their ruling ideology that I just don't think that it deserves the kind of attention that it's just not sustained if you look at the sources. There are little bits and pieces that seem to hint that way, but it's not that at all. Anyway, I could go on about this, but I think that's a myth, and I also think that it's a myth about Russia too. There are little hints and bits and fragments, but there's very little serious evidence that Russia regarded itself as a successor to New Rome, at least not before the late 19th century, which is a whole other era.
I think we've done around it up there. Hopefully you have a better understanding of Eastern Roman history and the impact that the Roman state has on the world history as well. Of course, if you should read more about it, and of course, if you want to find out more, we only touched the tip of the iceberg, because of course you can read much more on the book, The New Roman Empire, A New History of Byzantium. And then where can people find the book if they are interested in reading it? And do you have anything else you want to promote? You mentioned you writing a new book on the fall of Constantinople. So do you have anything else you want to share? And where can people find your podcast, Byzantium and Friends, and of course if they have further questions about Eastern Roman history, where can people find you if they wish to learn more?
Oh, I hope that not more people contact me with questions about East Roman. I get enough email as it is. There are unfortunately fewer of us active in the fields of study that East Roman history represents because of neoliberal downsizing to our universities. But no, I hope I don't become a kind of internet reference point where everybody sends me email. That happens enough as it is. So I'm fine with the amount of email that I get. But yeah, the podcast Byzantium and Friends has many episodes that might address the issues or topics that you're interested in. Otherwise, there is a very large and growing bibliography on every topic. Not all of it is esoteric and technical. So I hope that there are by now books that will make this really fascinating period of history accessible to everyone.
Thank you again so much for coming back. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you. This has been What That Age 12. You can find us on social media on Twitter/X or Twitter. And under What That Age 12, you can find us on Instagram and What That Age 12. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars. You can also give us 1 if you hated this podcast. It's up to you. It's a free world, at least on this side of the of our sphere. So you can also write a review on Apple Podcasts, and on reading those. You can find us on YouTube as well. So please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.